are y'all today? You awake? Good stuff. Thanks for coming. So I have a pretty hefty topic to talk to you about today. Racism, right? Probably makes us maybe a little bit uncomfortable. It's a conversation that your parents say, not at the dinner table, right? It's too impolite, causes too many issues. Definitely don't bring it up at your hiring employment interview, right? Don't do that. But as much as we don't like to talk about racism, that's my suggestion that we actually probably need to be talking about it more, right? The less you don't want to talk about something is an indication that our society needs to be having conversations about it. Specifically, I'm here to talk to you about white supremacy. Now, when y'all hear the word white supremacy, you probably think of white superiority groups, right? Like the KKK or something like that. And I think hopefully we're all on the same page that we don't need the KKK anymore, right? They need to be left in our history books. I don't know what they're still doing around. We should have gotten rid of them a long time ago. But when I refer to white supremacy, I'm referring to much more than just white superiority groups. I'm referring to the system and the foundation of the United States. But before I get to my theory of white supremacy, I want to talk to you a little bit about where I came from. So I can't tell you how many times students come up to me and say, Professor SP, that's what they call me because my name is way too long, right? Professor SP, what in the world, how did you as a white woman come to study racism and white supremacy? Where does that come from, right? That's not something you see every day. Well, the answer to that question has a little bit to do with where I come from. These are pictures of my elementary school in Chicago, Newberry Academy. And these are recent pictures, so the school looks a lot nicer than it did when I went to school. Gentrification has moved in. We know how that works, right? But when I went to school there was bars on the windows. There definitely were not plants. But suffice it to say that I spent the first 10 years of my life in the city of Chicago and had a lot of the city experiences that go along with that. When I was 10, my family moved me to rural Virginia. And I mean rural Virginia, okay? So my commute to my elementary school went from 1 block to an over 1 hour bus ride, yeah. And so these are pictures of Crozet Elementary where I went in Virginia. And you can see, right, it's nice. It's got big windows, lots of space, green pastures, rainbows, mountains, right? But I don't show you these two pictures to say that Chicago was some sort of horrible and Virginia was really great. Rather, what I ended up having was two very distinct experiences of race and racism, right? The contrast between the inner city of Chicago and rural Virginia. From my classrooms to interracial friendships and interracial relationships. And then later on in life, encounters with disciplinary authorities and police officers. I saw how race affected one's position in society and how people treated you. Now, back in the day, I wasn't as aware as I am now, right? I'm not gonna say I was always woke. I definitely wasn't, okay? I didn't know that it was racism. I didn't know what to call it back then. So I thought the best thing to do, like so many folks, was to get a good job, make good money, right? And that's how you get happy. You just go forward. I tried that path. It didn't feel very fulfilling. So later on in life, I came to the discipline of sociology, and I came to study race. And I understood that, in fact, race is a central organizing principle of society. And that epiphany has never left me. So like a lot of white folks, these conversations led me to discussions of white privilege. You may have heard this term around a lot, right? It's kind of gotten some cachet now. So what is white privilege, right? It's the ways in which whiteness is the normal, the standard, the yardstick against which all else is measured. So let me give you a few examples. Say you're heading down your local pharmacy aisle looking for Band-Aids. Right? And there are the skin tone Band-Aids. Well, whose skin tone is that, right? It's nearest the complexion of white folks, right? Same goes for nude clothing, right? Who's nude, yeah? Usually nearest the complexion of white people. Another example is take the movies. All right, so a new romantic comedy comes out, has a majority white cast. You turn to your friend, you're like, hey, let's go check out this new romantic comedy, right? Looks really good. All right. But now, say a new romantic comedy comes out, but it has a majority black cast. Then you say, oh, let's go check out this black romantic comedy, right? Because this is another example in which whiteness is the normal and the standard, and everything else becomes othered in relationship to that, right? So whiteness is the benefits, right? The benefit of the doubt that is given to white people. And on a lot of levels, this is a really useful concept. It forces white people to reconcile that they do have a race. They are raced, right? It's just that they're not made to confront it very often. So back in the day, I used to give talks on white privilege. And a lot of times when you're talking about white privilege to white people, it ends up in conversations of white guilt. Now, this makes sense on a lot of levels, right? If you're a white person and for the very first time you're having to confront the fact that everything you have earned maybe wasn't always 100% earned, right? That might feel bad. Or if you're coming to confront that people of color have an unfair reality because of our society, that might make you feel bad. And you probably should, right? If you don't feel bad about society treating some people unfairly, you probably need to check yourself. Okay? But what does white guilt do for us at the end of the day? If you have white privilege, you can't get rid of it. You can't just be like, oh, now I know I have it. Let me throw it away over here. No, you have it whether you want it or not. You can't just get rid of it. So admitting white privilege and reconciling with that is a good exercise, but it doesn't really affect the structure of racism. It doesn't really spur one to action. Likewise, for people of color, it might be useful or feel good to see white people finally recognizing that they do indeed have white privilege. But that doesn't necessarily affect the structure of racism. It doesn't really spur us to action. So that's why I like to focus instead on the concept of white supremacy. So what is white supremacy? It's the systemic and systematic ways that society gives benefits and opportunities to white people and denies those same benefits and opportunities to people of color. So there's two key terms in that definition: systemic and systematic. Systematic refers to the patterns of behavior. That is, over time, we can see that people of color are continuously oppressed, while white people are continuously given resources and opportunities. The other key term is systemic. That can be a little bit harder to understand. So I have an analogy for us. The box on the left is the way that people traditionally like to think of racism in society. So imagine you have like a 3D box, right? And white supremacy is in the box. So how do you solve the problem? You might tip the box over and white supremacy falls out. Yeah? Or you might reach in the box and you pull out white supremacy. But the box stays intact. Does that make sense? So the box is society. So in the first case scenario, all you have to do is pluck out the racism and you have an intact society. That's what people think we can do. That's how we traditionally like to think about it. But the reality is much more complicated than that. And that's the box on the right-hand side. So that's how it really works. Society, the box, itself is made up of white supremacy. The very folds of the box is white supremacy. So white supremacy is of society. It's not in society, it's of society. So if we understand that, that's a much harder problem to solve. So this conception of white supremacy has led me to a model that I call the white supremacy flower. Now, lots of folks have pointed out to me it'd probably be better to be called the white supremacy weed, right, instead of a flower, which I agree with, but for the purposes of the metaphor, the white supremacy flower works out. So there's three main components to the white supremacy flower: the roots, the stem, and the bloom, and I'm going to take you through it one by one. So first, the roots. So what are the roots of a flower? Right? It goes deep into the ground, yeah? It grabs the nutrients and the water that we need for the rest of the flower to grow. It provides the foundation. What is the foundation of the United States? Not so good. So we start off with Native American genocide. And when I say genocide, I really mean genocide, which we often don't like to admit. In 1400, we estimate that there were about 10 million Native Americans here on this land that we like to now call the United States. By 1900, that number, because of encounters with whites, had come down to 300,000. That's like taking the city of New York at about 10 million and bringing it down to the size of Cincinnati. We also have plantation slavery, where we went to the shores of Africa and stole Africans and brought them over here for labor. And plantation slavery in the United States was very severe, where we treated these human beings as though they were chattel. By the time of the Civil War, for every 7 free people, we had 1 enslaved person. Then we have our founding fathers who were taught to love. George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, who all owned enslaved people. Thomas Jefferson had 600 of them over the course of his lifetime. And these are the same folks who are writing our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, the ones who are saying all men are created equal. But in actuality, the Constitution was written to protect the rights of white male-propertied men. So then we get to our stem. So the stem, like a flower, right, represents how it's grown over time. So what has happened to the United States since our foundation and where we are today? Again, it's not so good, folks, okay? So we have Jim Crow laws, the severe segregation of blacks and whites in all sectors of our society, from schools to stores to transportation. We also have the continuous perpetuation of the oppression of Native Americans. In the late 1800s, we had the Dawes Act, which took 90 million acres of the West and parceled it out largely to white settlers. Of the 2.3 billion acres that is the United States today, approximately only 56 million of those acres is Indian reservations. That means they have about 2.5% of the original land they used to have. But blacks and Native Americans weren't the only communities of color that white people targeted. Lots of other folks also experienced oppression. So just a few examples. So lots of people don't realize that the Chinese came over here in the 1800s. We asked them to, yeah, for jobs. And then we said, oh, wait a second. We're getting a little afraid of you because you're doing a little bit better than we planned you doing in some employment sectors, and we didn't like that. So we instituted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned further immigration and prevented citizenship status for Chinese. Then during World War II, we started to freak out and we worried about all Japanese being potential traitors. So whether they were citizens or not, we forcibly removed over 100,000 Japanese from their homes, and we put them in internment camps for the rest of World War II. So again, right, we see the patterns, the systematic oppression that has happened over time that is connected to the roots of our foundation. So where does that bring us today? Here we are, we're at the bloom, the United States today. So you'll see that each one of the petals represents a different contemporary inequality, whether that be the prison-industrial complex, wealth inequality, residential segregation. You also see white privilege up there, which I'll come back to in a moment. But let's take a look at some of these current inequalities. Residential segregation, for instance. So sociologists can measure residential segregation between races on an index. and it goes from 0 to 100. And a 0 represents perfect integration, and a 100 represents perfect segregation. So in 8 metro areas, including the area of New York, we see a segregation index of about 70 to 80. Yeah, that's between blacks and whites. So that's pretty severe. It's what we call hypersegregation. Or we can look at wealth inequality. Now, wealth isn't income. Income just represents what you bring in, your wages or your salary. But wealth represents that and your assets. So it reflects historical accumulations of funds, of monies over time. So the median household net worth of whites is at $141,000. For blacks and Latinos, it's less than $15,000. I see all faces. Yes, it's a true story. Prison industrial complex, another place where we see contemporary inequality. So we know that there's a racial bias in the criminal justice system, where 1 in 3 black men and 1 in 6 Latino men are likely to face some level of imprisonment during the course of their life. It's 1 in 17 for white men. So you'll also see the pedal called white privilege, and that brings us back to where we started. So remember I said white privilege is a very important concept. It's something that we need to talk about. But in this model, you can understand that it's just one pedal. It's just one manifestation of the greater problem. It's not the whole problem. What we really need to be looking at is the whole flower of white supremacy. Another thing to pay attention to at this point is that today when we try to address contemporary inequality, we tend to address the symptoms without also addressing the causes. What do I mean by that? So for example, if we look at wealth inequality, we might try to solve that by giving out welfare or housing vouchers. But that only addresses the money aspect of it without also addressing racism. So we're going to miss the mark. We're going to fall short of a good solution. Or the criminal justice system, where you might address the bias in juries and courts and trials. But if you don't also connect that to white supremacy, then we're not going to have the best solutions. So let me back out again. Right? Here's the white supremacy flower as a whole. The roots, the stem, the flower. You can see that there's now a clear connection between what is going on today and our past. Our past hasn't left us. It is the foundation. And on a side note, this is a beautiful rendition of a flower that was drawn by a student of mine, but I am a horrible artist. And when I teach this, I just have a really reckless-looking daisy bloom. And the point is that any of you guys can draw this yourself. So next time you're having that conversation, someone says, racism isn't real, it's not around anymore. All you got to do is break this out, okay? I give you permission. So there's 3 main things that I think the white supremacy flower model does for us. Takeaways. 1, it shows a clear foundation of white supremacy and where we've come from. 2, it shows that racism has evolved, not dissolved. Just because racism looks different today than it did a few hundred years ago doesn't mean that it has left us. And 3, it highlights how we can all participate in the system of white supremacy. So just because you're white doesn't mean you support white supremacy. And just because you're a person of color doesn't mean that you don't support white supremacy. So much as that any of us participate and uphold this system, we are helping white supremacy. So in conclusion, I suggest that we need to go to our roots as a nation to have a more honest analysis of where we've come from so that we can provide better, efficient, more effective, multiracial solutions for today. Thank you.